Now we've had a chance to create objects by creating primitives, and we've had a chance to create hierarchies by grouping and parenting. I want to talk about selections in a little bit more detail. So far we've been selecting by just selecting objects by clicking on them. There's some more advanced ways to select to give you more control. And I'll discuss that. First I'm going to go to my selection tool, my arrow, make sure that's activated. Then I'm going to go up to the status line. In the status line there's an area that controls selections. For example, there's 3 buttons here that control how you're selecting. The middle one, which is activated right now, is called Select by Object Type. As long as that is activated, in other words grayed in, you can select objects in the scene. So I can go and click on this polygon sphere or this NURB sphere. Now that's actually activated by default, but that's why you're able to select. You can select objects. Now when this is activated, you have further control over what you're selecting in terms of objects. In fact, there's a whole set of filters to the right. From where this plus sign is all the way to the question mark, these buttons control what type of objects you're allowed to pick. Now, they're all activated right now, which means I can select anything in the scene. But if I was to click them and deactivate it, that could be more particular. In fact, when none of these are activated, I can pick nothing. I can try to click on my spheres here and I cannot select them. Now the trick for that is, if I am on Select by Object Type, I need to have at least the Surface button activated. This is a Surface button. That means that I can select surfaces in the scene, and in fact, this is a polygon sphere, which is a surface, as is this NURB sphere, which is also a surface. So as long as this is activated, I can select that. Now there's other buttons here too for various object types, and I'll just describe them briefly. We'll use these more as we go into different phases, such as modeling or animation through this video series. So for instance, the first button is Handles, which is something you use for animation. The next is Joints, which you use to rig a character or rig an object. Next one is Curves. We'll get the curves once we start to model NURB surfaces. Of course, we just talked about surfaces. Then there's Deformers, Particles or Dynamics, then Lights and Cameras. The very last one, the question mark, is Miscellaneous. So you can activate any of these that you want to in any combination you want to, and you can turn them on or off however suits you. Now this comes in handy because you might eventually get to a complex scene where you have multiple object types. You might have surfaces along with curves, along with joints, along with cameras, along with lights. And so in order to pick only the thing you really want, you can choose which button is activated. For instance, I might be working on a scene where I have surfaces and curves. Maybe I just want to pick curves and ignore the surfaces. Well, I can just activate the curves button, and then when I go to make selections in the view panel, I can only pick the curves and it ignores the surfaces. As I said, we'll demonstrate this once we get to the modeling. So for now though, we just have surfaces, so I only really need to activate the surface button. And then I can pick. So that's the Select by Object Type, and then all the object types that you can filter. Now there's another selection mode that's to the left of this button, which is the Select by Hierarchy mode. When that's activated, I can select group nodes while ignoring the children. Now I don't have a group in this scene right now, but we can make one. I'll go ahead and select these objects. Now there's another way to select which I haven't talked about, and that is simply click dragging a box inside the view panel. If my select tool is activated, and I click drag from an empty spot in the scene, and continue to hold my mouse, I will get a gray box. Anything underneath that gray box is selected when I let go of my mouse button. And whatever's in that select region or within that select box is automatically selected. So I've selected these 2 spheres. So let's make a group now. I'm going to go up to Edit, Group, to create the group. I know they're a group because they're both green, and I can see the group name in the channel box. Now before I made the group, I had no group. So when I'm in the hierarchy selection mode, when there is no group, you wind up just picking objects. However, if you do have a group, and you're in this mode, and I click on an object, the entire group is selected. In other words, the group node's selected, and the children turn green simply because they're part of the group. However, if I go to the outliner, we'll see how this is a little bit different. Here's the outliner. What's happened is, by going into this hierarchy select mode, when I clicked on a sphere, the group node itself is selected. If I expand this, you'll see the children there, but the children are not selected. So just the group node selected. Now these spheres turn green as an indicator that they're part of that group. However, it's just the group node selected. So when I do my transformations, of course, the entire group moves. It's really just the group node that's selected, and that is indicated by a channel box. Now I can always go back and select the children separately. Now if I'm in the select by hierarchy mode, I can't do that in the view panel. Every time I click on or off, I continue to get the group node. If I want to pick a child in the view panel, what I have to do is go back to select by object type. So now I'm on select by object type. So now when I select something, I'm selecting just a child. In fact, when I click on this polygon sphere, you'll see that the P-sphere is selected. So the P-sphere is blue. It's listed in the channel box to indicate that it is selected. Now the group node itself and the outliner does get a slightly gray box. That just indicates that one of the children is selected. In fact, now that child is selected, when I apply a transform like a move, I can move it separate from the group. In other words, the other sphere is unaffected, so I can move the sphere someplace new here, but then I can go back to the group if I want to. You see that I can still move the entire group, and this polygon sphere is still where I left it. So that's what's great about hierarchies. You can move any part of the hierarchy. Now, I can also make selections in the outliner separate from these selection controls up here in the status line. And when I click in the outliner, I'm simply selecting a particular node. So there's P-sphere, there's NURBS-sphere, and then there's a group node. I can select any of these nodes as I choose, regardless of how this is set up here in the status line. However, if the outliner is closed, you want to be aware of how this is set up here in terms of if you're selecting by hierarchy or if you're selecting by object type. Now there's a third selection mode up here that's to the right, which is select by component type, and that has the little 4 squares. Now we're going to have to talk about this more as we get into modeling, but I'm going to briefly introduce you to it right now. Now if this is activated to select by component type, you're able to select subcomponents of individual surfaces. And what those subcomponents are will vary based on the type of surface. For instance, I have a polygon sphere here and a NURBS sphere. They both have a slightly different set of subcomponents. Now, the subcomponents that you get to display and get to select is going to be based on this set of buttons here to the right. And that starts with this square and goes all the way to this question mark. And I'll briefly describe what those are. They're vertices, edit points, isoparms or edges, faces, hulls, pivot components, handles, and miscellaneous. Now, I'm not going to be able to describe those right now, but once we get into modeling, these will come into play. In any case, what will happen is, if you have a NURBS sphere versus a polygon sphere, this being the polygon sphere and this being the NURBS sphere, what you will see will differ, and what you're able to select will differ. But let me show you how this works just in general. So if I want to select, I'm on the select tool here, and I have my vertice button activated, I can pick vertices. Now, in the case of polygons, they're individual vertices, or you'll have a single vertex at the corner of each face, and the face is a little square on the surface. So for instance, I can click on one of these little dots, and that's a vertex. And let me dolly in closer so you can see a little bit better. So that's a single vertex, or I can click drag an entire box to select a whole bunch of vertices. So those appear on the surface of a polygon surface. If I go to my NURBS surface, it also has vertices, but they're off the surface because the NURBS surface is simply constructed differently and has different set of mathematics to make it work. In any case, I can select a single vertex on the NURBS surface or drag a box to select a bunch of vertices. Now there are additional component types up here, as I mentioned, but we're going to get into these as we talk about modeling more. But just like the select by object type, you can choose to filter what you're selecting. I can turn on all these buttons here, and then all those component types will become visible. And this is particularly noticeable on the NURBS surface. There's a whole bunch of individual components all of a sudden on the screen there. Or you can go back and turn off some of these filters and have control over what you see and what you select. Now, if you want to leave the component type, you can always go back to select by object type, and then you're back to selecting the entire object, and the components are no longer visible.